What would you do if you found a ring in your grandfather's attic, and it fit your finger perfectly, not because it was made for you, but because it was made from you? Tonight's descent takes us into the hills of Appalachia, where a single bloodline was preserved by unnatural means, not to survive, but to repeat, to marry itself, to birth itself. Again and again, they say the Elbridge family disappeared, but that's not true. They simply changed shape. Welcome to Gothic Ledger, where we don't just tell forgotten stories. We open sealed rooms. We read what was never meant to be read. And sometimes, we answer questions that should have stayed buried. If you're new here, write your location and the time you're watching in the comments. Let us know where you are when the lights start flickering. And if you're brave enough to keep turning these pages, like, subscribe, and help us keep this archive breathing. This story isn't just content, it's a map, it's a warning. They weren't supposed to dig that deep. It began in 1978, during a routine renovation of a crumbling farmhouse outside Stowe Hollow. The property had passed through 5 owners in 6 decades, each one selling for less than they'd paid, each one leaving without ceremony. Some claimed plumbing issues, others mold. But no formal complaints were ever filed, just silence and sudden departure. A young couple, recent transplants from Ohio, wanted to restore it. Their plan was to convert the property into a bed and breakfast, quaint, scenic. But when they lifted the old flagstones in the kitchen, stones warped by years of moisture and soft decay, the smell hit first. Not rot, not mold, sweetness, sickly sweet. The bones weren't buried properly, shallow, scattered, and unmistakably human. According to the sheriff's report, which I had to request via FOIA and still received heavily redacted, the remains were fragmentary, brittle and discolored. The forensic team determined that the bones belonged to at least 2 individuals, 1 adult, 1 child, possibly more. No formal identification was ever made, at least not officially. The town doctor at the time, Dr. Harlan Peck, was called to verify the scene. According to a former deputy who spoke to me under condition of anonymity, Peck entered the house, took 1 look and walked out. He never returned. He shuttered his practice a week later, retired early. When I contacted him in Florida this year, he hung up after hearing the word Elbridge. The preacher fled next, Reverend Talcott. He'd served the community for nearly 40 years, known for his resolve. He visited the site after the bones were discovered, not out of morbid curiosity, but because of the graveyard behind the property. He recognized the names. The headstones were old, unremarkable, save for the fact that they bore the same surname, Elbridge. 2 names stood out, Sarah and Abigail. According to town folklore, Sarah was the spinster who lived alone in the Ridge House in the late 1800s. Abigail, listed as her daughter, had no birth certificate, no baptismal record, and no surviving lineage. Except that's not entirely true. There was 1 birth certificate preserved in a county office vault, archived incorrectly, buried under a stack of Civil War pension claims. I found it by accident, while cross-referencing regional land ownership. Yellowed, brittle, but legible. Name: Jacob Elbridge, born December 12, 1869. Mother: Sarah Elbridge. Father: unknown. The paper was signed in dark brown ink, the kind that oxidizes like blood. No record of a marriage, no witnesses, just the name. After the discovery, town records were mysteriously amended. The property's original blueprints vanished from the assessor's office. Census data from 1890 went missing, microfilm reels scratched or erased. And yet, Jacob's name remained. A single thread the fire forgot to burn. Sometimes I wonder, were those bones the end of the story? Or the beginning? Or worse, were they simply shed skin, left behind by something still alive, still watching, beneath the floorboards of a house that was never meant to be opened? Some women vanish from history without a trace. Sarah Elbridge made sure her echo stayed. She was born in 1838 to a farming family that owned a small parcel of land high up on the Blue Ridge, soil too rocky for corn, too shaded for wheat, but far enough from town that silence came easy. According to the earliest record I could find, a church ledger, water-damaged and half-legible, Sarah stopped attending service at age 13. No explanation, just her name, followed by a faded dash. Locals referred to her later as the strange girl of the Ridge, unmarried, unaccompanied. She descended into town twice a month and always alone. Her dress never changed, her shoes wore through at the toes, and she carried a wicker basket filled with peculiar purchases. A spool of red thread, white stones, a block of beeswax, and always double rations, flour, beans, salt, one portion for herself, the other, people assumed, for a child no one had seen. But she had no husband, no ring, no explanation, just the voice. They said she spoke softly, too softly, like someone mimicking politeness but not feeling it. Her cadence was off, lilting. It reminded one woman I interviewed of a girl speaking to a doll, and her eyes, always lingering, never quite looking at you so much as through you. Jacob Elbridge's birth was never announced. His certificate, the one I found buried in the wrong drawer, simply states, born December 12, 1869, mother, Sarah, father, unknown. There was no doctor present, no midwife, just the ridge, the trees, and the girl who had become a woman without anyone noticing. And then the voices began. Not hers, theirs. Several old-timers I tracked down, descendants of the original families in the region, recounted the same thing, sounds drifting through the hills at night, chanting, but not in English, something older, heavier. One farmer said it was like two people reciting a poem in perfect unison. Only one was always half a beat behind. Sometimes laughter accompanied it, high and breathy, followed by a second laugh in perfect mimicry. Same pitch, same tone, just not human. What disturbed the townsfolk wasn't the noise, but the implication. Because there had only ever been one voice. Jacob, they said, was never seen, never brought to town, never enrolled in school. But Sarah's trips continued, and her basket never grew smaller. A woman raising a child in isolation is not uncommon in frontier Appalachia. But what Sarah was doing wasn't parenting. It was preparation. A sculptor molding wet clay. A mirror polished until it reflects not just the surface, but the soul. She wasn't raising a son. She was raising a reflection. And if that reflection ever broke, if it ever cracked, would it echo back, or would something step through? Some nights I wonder what would have happened if someone had gone up the ridge, but then again, maybe someone did. And maybe that's why no one speaks their name anymore. Some boys are raised in the shadow of their fathers. Jacob Elbridge was raised in the reflection of his mother. By the time he turned 15, no one in town could say they'd seen him, not clearly, not up close. And yet his presence hung over the valley like mist. Livestock went missing from neighboring properties. Tools left out at night were found rearranged by morning, patterns etched into the soil beneath them. Concentric, spiral, precise. One farmer claimed he saw a figure at the tree line, tall and motionless, barefoot in the frost, pale as birch bark. They assumed it was Sarah, until it moved. The few who glimpsed Jacob described something unfinished, too tall, limbs slightly too long, as if the proportions were still shifting. He never came to town, but Sarah still did, and one day she brought with her a gift. It was a ring, hand-carved. The wood was dark, polished smooth, almost lacquered. She asked the blacksmith to shape a silver inlay for it, delicate, precise, though she never said for whom. The inscription, though, would come to haunt me, to my life from your birth. Not the kind of thing a mother writes to a son, more like something you'd say to a lover, or a reflection, a gift not of affection, but of ownership, completion. The ring now sits in a display case at the County Museum. No context, no explanation, just a small plaque that reads, "Recovered near the Elbridge homestead, 1890s. But there's a detail most people miss. If you look closely beneath the inlay, the wood is scored, thin, almost imperceptible grooves worn by skin and time. Jacob wore it, constantly. That same year, the 1890 census was conducted. The Elbridge property, once a single cabin, had grown. The document lists Jacob Elbridge as head of household, age 21. His occupation is left blank, so is marital status. Beneath his name, another appears. S. Elbridge, female, age 52. No relationship noted, not mother, not wife, just present. That omission speaks louder than any designation could. The census taker, a man named Milburn, noted in his ledger that he was received coldly, not invited past the gate. He remarked that the land felt heavy and the structures on it connected in odd fashion, like organs stitched from separate bodies. Milburn died 6 months later, his throat crushed in an apparent barn accident. But his final field note is the one that still gives me pause. Scribbled at the bottom of the page, almost like an afterthought. The woman's eyes. He had them too. What Sarah created was not a household. It was a vessel, a continuation, a doubling. And what Jacob became was not a son, nor a man, but a mirror, shaped and polished until it stopped reflecting and started remembering. Sometimes I wonder, if you raise a reflection, does it ever learn to cast a shadow of its own, or does it wait until the light hits just right? They called it the house with no rooms, though that wasn't quite right. The Elbridge homestead had rooms, dozens in fact, but none that opened where they should. Doors led to dead ends. Hallways doubled back on themselves. Entire wings were constructed without windows, lined with warped mirrors that swallowed reflections like mouths. I've seen the floor plans sketched by a surveyor in 1894. He abandoned the project midway through. His notes dissolve into erratic lines and strange symbols. One page ends with the phrase, "I met myself. I should not have." No one went near the property by then. Not even the trappers who once used the ridge trails. The land had begun to fold. Pines near the homestead grew inward, their trunks bending as if pressed by some central force. Even birds avoided the air above it. You could stand at the edge of the woods and hear nothing. No wind, no insects, just stillness, like breath held. It's said that Jacob walked into town once during that time. He wore no shoes. His feet were cut and pale. He didn't speak to anyone, but stood in front of the general store for over an hour, staring at the reflection in the window. Not inside the shop, but his own image. People said he was dressed in Sarah's perfume, not just scented but steeped in it, cloying, sweet, suffocating. One woman fainted. Another swore she saw 2 sets of lips move when Jacob turned to leave. His, and a faint second impression just behind the glass. By then, Sarah Elbridge had vanished. No record of death, no obituary, nothing buried, just gone. And yet, Jacob began referring to my beloved in the third person. In his rare appearances, in ledgers, on tax forms, even on a note left at the church. He used the phrase like scripture, "She moves within the walls. The house remembers her touch. I tend her garden of silence." The sheriff at the time, Henry Lyle, made on a visit to the property after a petition was signed by townsfolk. He returned visibly shaken, refused to speak of it, and shortly after resigned. But in the margins of his final duty log, there's a line that's always stayed with me. He calls her mother and wife and God. I've since collected sketches from children who claim to have seen the house in dreams. Always the same image, a black hallway lined with mirrors and a tall figure at the end, holding hands with its reflection. The Elbridge home was not built for shelter. It was a shrine, a cocoon, a sacred womb designed not to house but to contain. And if the walls seem to turn inward, perhaps it's because they were never built to let anything out. Not light, not sound, not even time. Sometimes I wonder, when you build a home around a ghost, does it ever stop growing? Or does it just wait for you to move in? The invitation arrived in June of 1897, a single envelope wax-sealed, pressed not with a crest, but with the imprint of a human tooth, molar, intact root, too small for Jacob, too worn for a child. The paper smelled faintly of burnt sugar and lye. It was addressed to Dr. Elijah Griggs, a physician known less for his medical skill than for his discretion. His own notes, preserved in a private family archive, unpublished and unsigned, tell the story in fragments. I've studied them for months. What follows is drawn from those pages, and from what little remains in county records before he disappeared entirely. Griggs arrived at the Elbridge homestead on a moonless evening. The house did not greet him. Doors opened without hinges. A hallway breathed warm and damp, as if exhaling from beneath the floor. At the threshold, a mirror was placed flat on the ground. Griggs stepped over it. The entry room was filled with effigies, bone dolls meticulously carved, each one bearing the unmistakable features of Sarah Elbridge. Rows of them, bent in kneeling positions, draped in threadbare lace. Some had small rings affixed to their hands, shaped from curled bark and human hair. Griggs touched one and recorded, "Its eyes had been painted shut, but I could hear it whisper." In the parlour he found portraits, dozens. Sarah and Jacob again and again, aged not with time, but with stylized reverence. The brushwork suggested divine worship. Jacob always younger, kneeling, veiled in rose light. Sarah draped in bridal garments, a scarlet ring on her finger and fire in the background. One canvas was signed simply, "Two made one, without sin or bone." The most disturbing record comes at the end of his notes. Griggs discovered a chapel, subterranean, constructed of stone and clay, the air tight and perfumed with something like myrrh and rot. In the centre, a glass coffin sealed with wax and adorned with red ribbons. Inside lay Sarah, her body perfectly preserved, not embalmed, preserved. Hair combed, lips stained, eyes open. A veil was draped across her midsection, and Jacob's wooden ring, engraved with the words, "Forever my vow, in blood and breath," was tied to her wrist with a thread soaked in wine-dark resin. Etched into the chapel's wall were the words, "The bride returns when the sun is ready." Above it, a mural of two figures merged by fire, one ash-white, one bone-black, spiraling into a sunless sky. Griggs fled that night, abandoning his bag and horse. He reached town barefoot and silent, hands raw, eyes wild. He never practiced medicine again. Within a year, he vanished. His last written line, "It was not a tomb, it was a cradle." To love a ghost is one thing, to wed it is another. And if Sarah was bride and mother, then who, or what, was she preparing to return? Is that sun still rising, or are we simply waiting in its shadow? The Elbridge home caught fire in the early hours of October the 3rd, 1898. No storm, no lightning, just an orange glow over Black Hollow Ridge, seen by a travelling preacher who described it not as flame, but a pulsing lantern in the belly of the woods. By dawn, there was nothing left but a husk. Ashes, melted glass, and stone, so scorched it had fused into blackened teeth across the hilltop. The county coroner, Dr. Paul Marnes, recorded 3 bodies recovered from the site. Only one was officially identified. The rest remained unclaimed. The first was Jacob Elbridge. Though only 25 by records, the corpse bore the twisted posture of someone much older. Limbs arched backward, spine fused. His skin had blackened in patches, but not burned, almost calcified. Marnes noted that the mouth was open, as if he died mid-song. The second was Sarah, unchanged from the reports of Dr. Griggs the year prior. Her body had been sealed in a thick amber resin. It was not natural sap. Testing decades later revealed it was rendered from animal fat, turpentine, and teeth powder boiled to a shine. Her dress remained untouched, her lips still painted, one eye slightly open, the wooden ring still bound to her wrist by thread. But it was the third body that halted the investigation and ultimately buried it. The coroner's original notes, sealed and now held in a private collection, describe a malformed child, aged no more than 4. It had 6 fingers on one hand, no eyes, its skull elongated like a gourd, and its jaw, Jacob's exact jaw structure, was far too large for its frame. The pelvis was fractured not by fire but before death. Bones fused in ways that should not have been possible. Marnes wrote a single line in the margin. Incest is a sin. This is something worse. Rumours spread quickly that Jacob and Sarah had birthed a moonchild, that the fire was not accidental, but a rite gone, wrong, that the house had been built not to contain something, but to conceive it. Some said the third body had bark instead of skin. Others claimed it had whispered as it burned. A photograph was taken but disappeared from county archives in 1901. A local embalmer who had seen it described the image to his daughter years later. It looked like a reflection that didn't want to match. And here's what disturbs me most. The chapel, according to early blueprints, was directly beneath the nursery. A womb built under a cradle, a child buried above its birth. The fire may have ended the Elbridge house, but not its inheritance. In the soil near the ruins, local surveyors later uncovered a mirror, perfectly intact, face down in the dirt. When lifted, they saw nothing reflected, not the trees, not themselves, just darkness, as if the mirror remembered something it refused to show. So I ask, if Jacob was the father and Sarah the mother, who or what was the fire trying to erase? In the spring of 1905, a boy appeared on the southern edge of Elk Hollow. No family, no shoes, no history. Just a name sewn into the lining of his coat. E. Jacobson. 7 years old. Quiet. Eyes too dark for daylight. He was taken in by Reverend Elijah Clean, a widower who believed in second chances, especially for the lost. But the boy never slept in the rectory. He insisted on building a shelter outside the church, nothing more than a lean-to of river stones and pine boughs. He called it the cradle. Clean's journals, now preserved in the regional seminary archives, reveal a shift, subtle at first, then complete. A man of structure, order, and clarity, reduced to margin scribbles, cross-outs, and ink-blotted prayers. At first, he writes, "The boy is strange, but not cruel. He sings in Latin, I never taught him." Later, he carved a ring from a bone he found in the garden, wears it on a string, calls it a promise. And finally, he speaks with two voices. The first is a child's, the second is patient. One entry simply reads, "He said I was his son." Locals recall hearing strange humming in the churchyard long after sundown. Not hymns, not human. One neighbor, a mason named Olin Greyer, swore he saw the boy facing the chapel door at midnight, unmoving, mouthing something over and over. When asked what it was, Greyer wouldn't answer, only held up two fingers, then pointed to his throat. Visitors to Reverend Clean's church began to notice small carvings, rings etched into pews, door frames, even communion cups. Always two rings, interlocked. In one unearthed hymnal from 1906, there's a child's drawing tucked between psalms, a house with no roof, a woman with no face, and a figure with two mouths, one open, one sewn shut. The Reverend began speaking less, eating less, and then writing no more. The final journal entry is dated March 3rd, 1907. It reads, "He stands at my bedside. Says he dreamed of fire and bone and the river under the floor. He says I must be ready, for the bride returns when the sun is ready." Clean vanished weeks later. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. The only clue was a mirror, propped against the church's altar, reflecting the open doorway where no one stood. E. Jacobson was never seen again. But here's what haunts me. In a local antiques shop, I found a child's bone ring tucked in a reliquary case mislabeled mourning jewelry. The vendor said it came from the old seminary grounds. Inside the ring, barely visible, was a carving, Elbridge reborn. We often think of evil as loud, violent, unmistakable. But what if it's quieter than that? What if it returns to us not as a monster, but a child with a familiar name and a voice not entirely his own? And when he speaks, are we even hearing him? I found the remains of Reverend Clean's cottage outside Elk Hollow, overgrown with brambles and vines, half swallowed by the land that once hosted its flame. A stone chimney stands like a headstone, its top blackened like it was burned from within. The rest is ash, brittle glass, and scorched floorboards sunk into the earth. The fire occurred in 1908, less than a year after E. Jacobson vanished. There was no investigation. The town had grown tired of mysteries that had no appetite for resolution. But the coroner's ledger, retrieved from county archives, describes Clean's body with clinical discomfort. Eyes covered in cloth, stitched at the corners, mouth sewn shut with coarse thread, limbs arranged in the position of prayer. He had not died in the fire. He had been prepared for it. His heart was removed post-mortem, not surgically, but with unsettling care. No evidence of forced entry, no accelerants, just kindling. And then there's the final page from Clean's journal, miraculously recovered, though smoke-stained and brittle. It reads, in an unsteady hand, "She came back, as fire, and took me." No name, no signature, just that single trembling line. In the ruins of the house, beneath a floorboard marked with two interlocking rings, I found something no one had catalogued, a charred music box. Inside, sealed in melted wax, was a mirror shard. Upon its surface, a faint impression, possibly lips, possibly something else. The wax around it had hardened like resin, preserving the curve of a jaw, I swear, I've seen before. Witness accounts from that week are sparse and fragmented. A groundskeeper at the seminary reported seeing Clean at dusk, standing barefoot in the field behind the chapel, said his hair was singed, said he was weeping, but not with sorrow, with awe. That same evening, someone broke every window on the church's southern side, from the inside. And then he was gone. The boy, too, vanished. No tracks, no footprints, no records beyond those already fading in the seminary's forgotten margins. But in the choir room, etched into the underside of the piano lid, is a line repeated 5 times. The bride returns when the sun is ready. Who is the bride now? Sarah, once preserved in resin like a saint. Jacob, rotted but obeyed. The child, malformed and impossible. Or does the bride simply become whoever survives long enough to forget who they were? Fire, in the Elbridge story, isn't punishment. It's transition, a womb that burns instead of bleeds, a shell cracked open to release the next form, each blaze more precise than the last, never wild, always orchestrated, and in each instance someone watches from the smoke. Someone prepares the body, someone survives. I keep wondering about the phrase Clean wrote before his death. She came back as fire. But what if it wasn't her? What if it was always them? In the fall of 1934, a government topographer named Louis Penn was assigned to chart mineral runoff near the old Elbridge land, a task so mundane it barely merited mention in the Department of Interior's ledgers. But Penn's notes, preserved in a warped, leather-bound field journal now held at the County Historical Society, tell a far stranger story. He refers to it simply as the well, though no such structure appears on the 1887 township map or any subsequent plat. According to Penn, it was covered with a rusted grate, hidden beneath wild thistle, 20 feet from the ruins of what once may have been a smokehouse. He believed it to be a cistern until he climbed down. His journal changes after that. The handwriting shifts, becomes cramped, repetitive. Spiral stair, worn smooth, stone dry, no water, no moss, just down. He counted 42 turns before the light from above disappeared. He never reached the bottom, only the center. There, Penn writes, he entered a chamber perhaps no larger than a root cellar. The walls were studded with cracked mirror fragments, some embedded like teeth, others leaning in splintered wooden frames. They reflected not just his image, but movement. He noted breathing behind the glass, shadows cast without light. At the far end stood a child-sized chair, not dusty, not worn, polished, like it had been used just yesterday. Etched into its back was a ring, 2 circles interlocked, bound by a crooked vertical line. Underneath, in a child's handwriting, "The bride returns when the sun is ready." Again. Beneath the chair, Penn found a metal band, twisted, scorched, engraved with the name E. Jacobson. It was still warm to the touch. His final note, jagged and scrawled in the journal's margin, simply reads, "She's here." The journal was recovered weeks later by a second surveyor sent to locate Penn. He never found the well, but he did find the booze. K, lying open atop a flat stone near the center of the property, marked with a burnt ring of ash around it. That entry ends the federal survey. The land was deemed unstable, and further work was quietly discontinued. When I visited the site last spring, I found no well, no stone, and certainly no stairs. But near the edge of the woods, I noticed something odd, a flock of birds circling a point of open air, always clockwise, never breaking formation, as if tracing something they could see that I could not. People imagine horror as something that chases or devours. But what if it waits? A womb beneath the soil, a chamber wrapped in mirrors, a chair no child outgrows. If Penn descended to the center, then what was rising to meet him? And is it still rising? I first came across the name Thomas Lee in a citation buried deep within an abandoned graduate thesis, an unpublished anthropology study filed at Appalachia University in 1979. No advisor signature, no departmental seal, just 143 pages of obsessive, spiraling notation. The title was handwritten in pencil on the cover: The Elbridge Persistence, Folklore, Birthrights, and Territorial Recursion. The university had no record of Lee ever graduating. His advisor, Dr. Kessler, died the same year under what the obituary called self-inflicted wounds of an ambiguous nature. Lee himself vanished weeks later. According to campus logs, his final library withdrawal was a map of Knox County dated 1854. What Lee uncovered, if it can even be called that, wasn't a singular event, but a shape. His work tracks over 70 disappearances spanning 144 years, all radiating outward from the old Elbridge property like ripples, or more precisely, like a spiral, a narrowing gyre. He cross-referenced these vanishings with local birth records, chapel logs, and death notices. Names change, faces blur, but patterns remain. A woman and a boy, always close, always new to town. They arrive quietly. They leave nothing. Sometimes a fire marks their departure. Other times, just silence. In one of his final sketches, found tucked into the back of the thesis, Lee depicts a grotesque figure, a merging of mother and son. Two heads branching from one neck, one mature and maternal, the other childlike, with a jaw far too large. Both faces are stitched at the mouth, and their arms form a perfect circle. The ring again, the Ouroboros, a womb encircling its own progeny. But what disturbed me most wasn't the image. It was what he wrote beneath it, in smeared ink. The blood runs backward. She marries what she births. The last trace of Thomas Lee was a call made to the county coroner's office in late October. He left a message. "I've heard the tape." His voice trembles, then splits, like he's speaking over himself, a male and female tone, layered imperfectly. "It's not a story," he says. "It's a room." "It's not a curse," the second voice adds. "It's a choice." Then silence. Then fire. Local legend says the forest near the Elbridge site still flickers at night with no visible source. Some blame methane. Others swear they've seen two figures standing within the glow, one tall, one small, neither casting a shadow. There are no more pages after that. No body was ever found. But tucked inside Lee's thesis, at the center fold, was a single ring. Wooden, hand-carved, warped from heat. It fit my finger exactly. We talk of bloodlines as if they move forward, linear, inheritance as a progression. But what if the line only seems straight, because we can't see it folding back into itself? What if the line never broke? What if it never needed to?